Hello and good afternoon to you all. Now it's time for a big task that we're going to discuss for an hour and a half or so. Growing equal within the boundaries of the planet. Environment, climate and sustainable development. No small task. And we've got some great speakers coming up, giving their expertise on the subject, followed by panel discussions. My name is Þóra Arnórsdóttir. I come from Iceland. I'm a TV reporter and a lot of other things. We're few, so all of us have to do quite a few other things. But we're, as usually, going to start with what's called a culture act. On the stage is gonna step Emil Jensen. He's Swedish. You could call him a singer, songwriter, and it's not just about love and happiness, but his lyrics include a lot of critics. He discusses human rights, gender equality, environmental issues. He sings in Swedish, but I'm pretty sure you're gonna love it. Emil Jensen.
Tack så hjärtligt. Jag är det kulturella inslaget. Det känns ju underbart. Och jag tänker här nu på en sån här stor arena, lite gläs, och börja med att kolla ni som sitter där allra längst bak. Hör ni vad jag säger? Härligt. Och ni som sitter där allra längst fram, förstår ni vad jag menar? Det är en väldig skillnad nämligen. Jag kommer inte reda ut den mer här under de närmsta 8,5 minuterna av era liv. Och det är så att det här ämnet då ligger mig väldigt varmt om hjärtat här med hållbar utveckling. Och jag är så glad över att jag gjorde en helt miljövänlig turné för några år sedan. Jag gjorde hela min sommarturné per cykel. Det blev 300 mil med gitarren på ryggen och elektroniken på styret och scenografin på pakethållaren genom Sommarsverige. Och det var en underbar turné för att det fick sånt medialt genomslag så att folk visste när jag skulle passera genom deras byar och städer och sådär. Så att folk stod längs vägarna med kladdkakor och öl och läsk och kaffetermosar och sådär. Och ibland sprang folk med en liten bit som i Forrest Gump då ungefär. Och jag fick även bo hemma hos folk och äta hemma hos folk när det åskade och regnade. Så att det var en underbar turné på det sättet. Jag insåg att folk är ett underskattat folk. Och det brukar heta när det gäller hållbar utveckling att vi måste ta ett steg tillbaka. Men för mig var de här veckorna ett stort steg framåt. Och det har jag haft i åtanke när jag funderat kring de här frågorna de senaste åren. Tyvärr fick det ett motsatt slut den här turnén. Jag blev brutalt nedslagen av nynazister i Trollhättan vid slutet av turnén. Så det är ju två sidor det här då. Och det här har fått mig fundera över den värld vi lever i. Den som vi då alla här inne vill förändra på ett vis. Och jag har slagit så de sista åren tanken att jag bor i en värld där det finns en gud. Och jag bor i en värld där det inte finns en gud. Och det är samma värld. Exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en värld full av minareter och judiska högtidligheter och kristna trosamfälligheter och shintoistiska, vad deras grej nu heter. Och det är samma värld. Exakt samma värld. Och jag bor i en nyliberal värld där folk tror på mammon och tillber tillväxtligheter och överflödigheter och materialiteter. Och jag bor i en värld full av fattiga asketer. Asketer utan religionstillhörigheter som blivit asketer för att de är lågavlönade esteter. Som tror på sina egna konstnärligheter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en new age-värld med vattensängar och sjögrästapeter. Människor som kan prata med alger och spå i maneter. Dansa med valar och jamma med änglatrumpeter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en fredlig värld där alla levande entiteter är allt annat än isolerade enheter. Där alla personligheter och identiteter egentligen är en och samma världsande som det då heter. Och jag bor i en värld där vi har ihjäl människor som tillhör andra nationaliteter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en värld där vissa vanligheter stelnar till normaliteter. Och där de raraste av rariteter mobbas ut som avvikande abnormiteter och konstigheter. Och jag bor i en värld där vi älskar olikheter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en värld där sådana som jag är minoriteter. Och jag bor i en värld där sådana som jag är majoriteter i samma värld. Och jag bor i en värld där det som vissa kallar friheter, för andra bara ensamheter. Och det som för vissa är tryggheter, för andra är tristess och tråkigheter i samma värld. Och jag bor i en värld där vissa teknikaliteter har gjort att vi kan nå varandra med enorma hastigheter. Och jag bor i en värld där vi glider ifrån varandra meter för meter. Jag bor i en värld där vi dras till varandra som magneter och frossar i trevliga täter och slukar varandras kroppsligheter och härligheter i olika former av kärligheter. Och jag bor i en värld där vi hatar och hytter och hotar och allt vad det heter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en värld full av taggtråd, stängsel, murar och staketer. Och jag bor i en värld full av broar mellan jämlikheter och jämställdheter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Och jag bor i en värld där vi röstat fram ett parti som styrs av ryggradslösa slämmigheter. Jimmy och andra brännmaneter. Som delar upp folk efter kön, ras och sexualiteter. Och skyller kriminaliteter på etniciteter. Och har importerat straffmentaliteter. Och vill exportera alla de inte kan uttala vad de heter. Och jag bor i en värld som blomstrar av solidariteter, öppenheter och generositeter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en värld där rika människor som heter Peter Wallenberg och äger marker och fastigheter, egna fotbollslag och atleter och stora oljefyndigheter. Och jag bor i en värld där en stor familj trängs på 12 kvadratmeter. Utan vatten, mat eller saniteter. Utan minsta möjligheter till mänskliga rättigheter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en värld full av sprakande solar och strålande stjärnor och frodiga planeter. Supernovor, svarta hål och vilda kometer. Öppna hav, forsande floder, heta vulkanaktiviteter. Sagoskogar och myllrande liv, mysterier och hemligheter. Som fyller oss med tacksamheter och ödmjukheter och visioner om hållbarheter. Vi vet att den här världen har begränsade kapaciteter. Ändå bor jag i en värld där vi varje minut skövlar, plundrar och bränner flera kvadratkilometer av samma värld. Jag bor i en värld där när det regnar, då det himlen gråter, det heter. Och när det pissar ner, det är någon som tömmer Guds kateter. För jag bor i en värld där det kainar poeter skymfar heligheter. Och jag bor i en värld helt utan yttrandefriheter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Jag bor i en värld där det finns en Gud och jag bor i en värld där det inte finns en Gud. Och det är samma värld. Jag bor i en värld som är det värsta helvetet av alla helveter. Och jag bor i en värld som är paradisplaneten av planeter. Och det är samma värld, exakt samma värld. Och det är världen den heter. Tack så hjärtligt. Och jag tänkte jag skulle knyta ihop den här dikten med en hyllningslåt till alla er, eller alla som engagerar sig. Till alla som har en gnutta fantasi. För fantasi är bland det viktigaste som finns i hela världen. Det är inte godhet som håller oss från ondska, det är fantasi. Det var fantasi som fick miljoner tyskar att inte lyda order. Det är fantasi som får oss att inte göra jobbet och inte vara till lags. Och det är fantasi som får oss att lägga näsan i blöt. Den där livsavgörande blöta näsan som faktiskt kan rädda liv. Och det är fantasi som får oss att tänka att världen inte måste se ut exakt så som den gör just nu. Det är fantasi som får oss att känna vad andra människor känner. Empati är inget annat än fantasi. Fantasi är trolleri. Det är fantasi som gör att alla här inne just nu kan se framför sig hur drottning Silvia äter en falafelrulle. Lite ovant sådär, så det kommer isbergssallad och blandad sås på pälsmudden på rockarmen. Fantasi är trolleri. Och det här är en hyllningsmelodi till alla er som har en gnutta fantasi. Som vet att en mur bara är en bro på högkant. Ni som vet att en mur bara är en bro på högkant. Att det som det är inte måste vara konstant. Ni som hör rop på hjälp när ingen annan hör det. Gör det ni gör och aldrig får något för det. Låt det ni bli, finns ingen annan där som gör det. Ni som går dit ni går utan att någon annan styr er. Ni som får era sår utan att ni blir martyrer. Ni som drömmer men aldrig blundar för det som händer. Glömmer era fiender men aldrig vänner. Gömmer och hjälper människor ni inte känner. Ni är inte vackrast i världen. Världen är vackrast i er. Och det är inte i era ögon. Det är i vad ni ser. Ni som skrattar er fram till det sjukt seriösa. Ni som får folk att undra om ni borde få gå lösa. Ni som alltid gör fel och aldrig är perfekta. Spelar inga spel och skiter det korrekta. Som vågar vara snea och defekta. Ni är inte vackrast i världen. Världen är vackrast i er. Och det är inte i era ögon. Det är i vad ni ser. Och hur ni lyckas inspirera. Får mig att vilja orka mera. Utan att jag känner mig sämre. Eller måste prestera. Och hur ni lyckas exaltera. Får mig att orka vilja mera. Det hörs på era röster. Det lyser igenom när jag ser er. Så ni är vackrast i världen. Världen är vackrast i er. Och jag ser det i era ögon. Där ser jag vad ni ser.
Thank you very much, Emil Jensen. I could hear the Swedes laugh out loud. Others were trying to catch all the game of words that he was playing on. Wonderful lyrics. You should watch it again when it gets shown on Swedish TV. But now we are starting this session, Growing Equal Within the Boundaries of the Planet. Environment, climate and sustainable development. An immensely important issue which reaches much further than just the question of gender equality. We have great experts that are going to step on stage and talk. First, it's going to be Caroline Hannan. She is an associate professor at the University of Lund in Sweden. She's going to talk about the gender-responsive strategies for meeting the challenges in environment, climate and sustainable development. Then we have the Norwegian Gunhild Stordalen. She's the founder and chair of the Stordalen Foundation and Green Nudge. She's going to talk about the women's key role in the transition towards healthier diets and a more sustainable food production. Right on spot. After her, Josefina Skerk from Sweden steps up here. She is an indigenous environmental activist and a Sami parliament member, and is going to talk about the experiences from indigenous women's advocacy. Last but not least is going to be Annika Karlsson Kanyama from Sweden, Program Director for Climate Tools at the FOI, which is the Swedish Defence Research Agency. The question is there a difference between women's and men's consumption behavior and therefore their impact on climate? Great question. I hope she will manage to give us at least some hint of an answer, and if not, I'm going to press her for it during the panel discussion afterwards. But first, Caroline Hannan, welcome.
They're not going to let me speak now. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everybody. My topic this afternoon, or our topic this afternoon, environment, climate and sustainable development, has mobilised politicians, planners, researchers, activists and the general public around the world for decades. Research, debate, conferences and negotiations have kept the goals of protecting our planet and ensuring a sustainable future for coming generations high on the political agenda. The urgency of the issue is well illustrated by the clearly documented risks to the planet posed by climate change and the crises that the world has experienced in recent years. Food crises with devastating effects in Africa and major natural disasters with significant loss of life. At the same time, there's been a long, impressive history of feminist efforts to bring attention to women and gender equality perspectives in all areas of environment, climate and sustainable development. Women's organisations and networks provided much of the initial impetus and leadership and continue to play a key role today. Efforts to link women and gender equality issues to environment and sustainable development, particularly at local levels, while clearly identifying women's specific vulnerabilities, also led to heightened understanding of women's essential contributions and their key roles as agents of change. An increasing awareness that the goals related to environment and sustainable development, and more recently those directly linked to climate change, are not achievable without the equitable involvement and contributions of women as well as men. The highlighting of women and the environment as one of the 12 critical areas of concern in the Beijing Platform for Action in 1995 was an important outcome of this work. In this presentation, I'm going to highlight some of the challenges and the potentials in efforts to move forward in the area of climate change. Many of the issues linked to climate change, such as energy, water, forests, biodiversity, and global warming, as well as critical patterns of behaviour, such as land use and consumption, had long been on the global agenda, and efforts were already well underway to bring attention to women and gender equality in these areas. Climate change, however, added new challenges to this ongoing work. It is not yet sufficiently recognised that climate change is not gender neutral. Gender inequalities intersect directly with climate risks and vulnerabilities. Because of their responsibilities for food security, provision of household water and energy, and income-generating activities relying on natural resources, women in many parts of the world, in rural areas, can be disproportionately affected by the changes and shifts in their local environment. These women are more at risk because of their strong dependencies on climate-sensitive natural resources for their livelihoods. Long-standing gender inequalities, such as lack of access to and control over essential resources, including credit, technology, and information, limited decision-making potential and bargaining power at the household and community levels, and time poverty due to their multiple roles, can constrain women in their capacity to adapt to rapidly changing climate conditions. At the same time, it's very important to keep in mind that women are not only vulnerable, but are also powerful agents of change, with knowledge and experience and contributions which are critical to mitigating and adapting to the effects of climate change. In many high-risk areas in the world, women have unique knowledge of local conditions and environmentally safe practices, which can be invaluable in building resilience and strengthening the adaptive capacities of both households and communities. All areas of climate change action, assessment of loss and damage, mitigation, adaptation, financing, technology, and capacity building have gender equality dimensions which need to be explicitly addressed, both in order to enhance the effectiveness and the sustainability of the interventions and to ensure that actions taken do not exacerbate existing gender inequalities. So the nationally appropriate mitigation actions and national adaptation plans established under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change should build on and benefit from women's valuable experience and skills and their potential as agents of change. Despite the fact that many of the climate change success stories are at community levels, local groups often face barriers to accessing and benefiting from existing public and private equity funds and from capacity building interventions. If we look back on the gender equality work in this area over the past 20 years, we can certainly see much has been achieved. But nonetheless, there are many serious constraints and challenges to achieving the goals that governments set for themselves in the Beijing platform. The big question at this Nording Forum is how to create new momentum to ensure that we move forward. As in many other areas, there's perhaps not so much a need to build completely new strategies as the need to seriously review and revitalise implementation of those strategies we have. It is clear that in many cases, implementation efforts have only been very half-hearted and have never ever been seriously resourced. Ensuring a stronger focus on the local level and on socio-economic factors is one key entry point for strengthening the work. Technical and financial solutions are certainly critical for meeting the challenges of climate change, but these will only be successful if attention is paid to the social context in which such solutions are to be implemented. Recent attention to climate justice and to human rights perspectives on climate change provides us with potential to enhance attention to gender equality, and focus on strong stakeholder engagement also provides new opportunities. One of the greatest challenges is the persistent over-focus on women as victims. Although it's much less common than a decade ago, it's still possible to find women listed together in important documents with children, disempowered youth, the elderly, and the sick and the disabled as vulnerable groups. It's critical to go beyond this victim vulnerable group focus to recognise women's essential contributions as enablers of change, particularly those roles beyond the family and household level. At the same time, what is not needed is more rhetoric on women's roles and responsibilities and contributions. We know already that women are critical agents of change, but recognition of this should lead to practical action, to specific changes in goals, in policies, budgets, strategies, and programs on the ground. Strong and innovative efforts have been made over many years to ensure that gender balance is secured, gender equality experts are involved, and gender equality perspectives taken into account in the processes through which key global policies and conventions are negotiated and agreed. This is critical work, since these policies and conventions guide work on climate change at all levels. Some successes have been achieved, but overall progress has been slow and the outcomes uneven. More progress has been made on the Convention on Biodiversity and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification than in the context of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed for the very first time on text on women's participation and gender equality in 2001. More recent examples of progress include texts stating that gender equality and women's participation are necessary for effective action on all aspects of climate change, which was included in the outcome of the Climate Change Conference in Cancun in 2010. What remains now is concerted efforts to ensure full implementation of these outcomes in the context of the work on the Framework Convention. This will require the development of strong follow-up and accountability mechanisms. References to gender balance, women's participation, and sex disaggregated statistics are reasonably concrete and measurable, but the short, vague references in many agreements to increasing attention to gender-sensitive approaches, gender considerations, gender aspects, and gender as a cross-cutting issue need to be unpacked in terms of concrete, practical implications. What does this mean for mitigation? What does it mean for adaptation, for technology, for financing and capacity building? This work of influencing important global processes has entered a critical phase now with the upcoming climate change conferences in Lima and in Paris over the coming year, in preparation for the negotiation of a new climate change convention in 2015. This is a unique opportunity which must be fully utilised. Many gender specialists are at this moment working to influence these processes at a preparatory meeting in Bonn, trying to promote gender equality as a fundamental principle for the new convention and to identify entry points for new actions. A key strategy in this context must be to build strong alliances, to be able to show in real terms how challenging gender inequalities and stereotypes and securing rights and empowerment for women will maximise the efficiency and the effectiveness of interventions and resources and contribute positively to the achievement of climate change goals. Non-governmental organisations are often the driving force behind efforts to influence global policies and conventions. In recent years, there's been an increased positive practice of alliances between NGOs and UN agencies and NGOs and governments. And this has resulted in greater access by gender equality specialists to important processes and more effective common efforts to secure attention to gender equality perspectives. Civil society organisations have also done very strategic work in some countries to develop climate change and gender action plans at national level, which provide good practice examples on what can be done in practical terms. The contributions of women's groups and women's networks should be further acknowledged and new partnerships and more strategic opportunities for collaboration developed. What I prioritise post-2015 to create new momentum is strong, visible leadership and accountability from those in positions of power and responsibility, while gender equality activists and practitioners within NGOs and research organisations and government organisations will continue to play critical roles. This work cannot be left entirely up to them. Those with real power over goals, policies, plans, budgets and strategies must face up to their responsibilities, and we must become much, much better at finding ways to hold those in power accountable. It is time for serious leadership to produce more substantial gender equality outcomes in the area of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So sorry for this technical difficulties. Very good job. It looked like a conspiracy. I'm assuring you it wasn't. These things happen. So this was Caroline Hannan. Next on stage is Gunhild Stordalen from Norway, the founder and chair of the Stordalen Foundation and Green Nudge. She's going to talk about women's key role in the transition towards healthier diets and more sustainable food production. Gunhild, welcome.
Humanity today faces several major global challenges. But as a medical doctor and a climate activist, I will highlight two of these challenges today. And both are urgent, and women are a key part of the solution. The first is about climate change and the environment, and the second is about global health. Until now, these challenges have been seen as separate issues. The fact is, however, that they are highly interconnected. And a lot of this has to do with food and the way we produce it. And we want to succeed in tackling these challenges related to food, health and sustainability without a new, holistic, integrated approach. And using we, it literally means us. Because women play a key role in the transition towards healthier diets and more sustainable food production. So, in other words, ladies, we are shouldered by a historically responsibility. I will get back to why women, in particular women from developing countries, play a key role in solving these issues, and how we can ensure that these women become the change makers we are dependent upon. But before jumping to solutions, let me spend a few minutes addressing these challenges. During the last few decades, there has been a dramatic shift in the global burden of disease. For the first time in history, more people die from obesity than hunger. While almost 900 million still go hungry every day, more than 2 billion people are now either overweight or obese. And overweight and obesity is a major risk factor for non-communicable diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancers, diabetes type 2. And these chronic lifestyle-related diseases have now outpassed infectious diseases in terms of absolute numbers, becoming the world's biggest killer, accounting for 63% of the global annual deaths. These chronic diseases used to be a Western phenomenon. It's not anymore. These diseases are now increasing fastest in the low and middle income countries, where 80% of the premature deaths before the age of 60 occur. So while these countries are still struggling with hunger and malnutrition, developing countries now faces a double burden of disease, and this represents a major barrier to economic development and to equality. And bad food, unhealthy diets, is a major driver of this epidemic. But what we put on our plate is not only a matter for our personal health, it's also a matter for the health of the planet. Did you know that the agriculture sector today is the world's single biggest emitter and accounts for as much as 20 to 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions? And that's more than the transport sector. In addition, food production, the global food system, is the single most important driver of deforestation, loss of biodiversity, depletion of marine ecosystems, land use change, and consumption of human fresh water. And what kind of food we produce really does matter. For example, meat production is enormously environmental footprints compared to that of growing plants such as grains and vegetables. Indeed, the meat industry alone accounts for as much as 15% of the global emissions and occupies 2/3 of the world's available agricultural land. Indisputably, our food system is putting the planet under extreme pressure. At the same time, one third of all food produced never gets eaten. It's either lost or wasted down the food value chain. And this is not only terrible, it's dramatic. Because in less than 4 decades, we will have another 2 billion mouths to feed. And with the current trends in economic development and changing dietary preferences, food production will have to increase by 60% by mid-century to meet the growing demand. I think we all agree that we don't need a rocket scientist to draw the conclusion. The current food system is broken and change is inevitable. To feed 9 billion healthy people on a stable planet, we will have to produce more food in a more sustainable way. But changing the global food system is not possible without involving half the world's population. Not only because 70% of the world's smallholder farmers are women, or because women are the key stakeholders on children's and families' dietary choices, but because as the population growth will occur in Africa and in Asia, most of the expected increase in food production will have to occur on these continents. Today, smallholder farmers, women, tend to produce less food than their male counterparts. But if women had the same access to information and productive resources as men, they could increase yields on their farm by up to 30%. And therefore, we must facilitate women's opportunities not only to produce food to keep their families alive, but to produce food for the market, in order for those who are not owning land also to benefit from the increased food production. The question is not whether if we should do this. The question is, how can we do this? And coming from academia, I strongly believe in evidence-based knowledge, and I believe that science holds the key to a sustainable future. The triple helix of food, health, and sustainability has proven inseparable when it comes to examining the current state of the world. We need more interdisciplinary knowledge, but evidence alone has probably never really changed the world. Knowledge must be translated into practice. And historically, all paradigm shifts has come as a result of another triple helix, that of science, business, and politics. And business has to become part of the solution, not only part of the problem. But in order for business to operate and innovate in the desired direction, predictability and the right types of regulations and incentives are required. And therefore, the policymakers have to be on board. I strongly believe that this triple helix, representing food, health, sustainability on the one hand, and science, business, and politics on the other, is a recipe for change. And I also believe that this recipe can be applied to women, facilitating their role as a catalyst in the required sustainable, healthy food revolution. Let me give you a concrete example. A few weeks ago in Sweden, the inaugurational Eat Stockholm Food Forum gathered 400 delegates from 28 countries. Among them, some of the world's most influential and important experts from science, business, and politics. And these people met in Stockholm to discuss challenges related to food, health, and sustainability. Together with Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Resilience Center, we started the EAT initiative to catalyze change in the global food system. In addition to offer an annual platform, EAT creates a long-term collaborative network of research institutions, universities, NGOs, trade unions, and corporate companies. And the objective of the EAT initiative is to spur more interdisciplinary research, facilitate innovation and broadcast best practice from industry, encourage development of new policies, and last but not least, facilitate behavioral change at scale. And I believe a similar alliance for policymakers, scientists, and business is required to succeed in changing the framework to empower women. And I believe that a closer collaboration with corporate companies is crucial, because more sustainable capitalism is key to change. Not only globally, this mentality has to be applied locally to raise small-scale farming to a sustainable future level. This radical shift, however, requires much more than microcredit. And as one of the keynote speakers at the EAT Forum said, Mr. Chibonga, he is the CEO of the National Smallholder Farmers Alliance in Malawi, he stated, "We need a paradigm shift in small-scale farming, going from subsistence to farming business." And knowing whom these small-scale farmers are, there is no doubt that we need a new approach. We can't solve future problems with tools of the past. And I will sum up. I assume that the most frequent word here at Nordic Forum is gender equality. And although there is still a way to go, the increasing equality between men and women has really changed Europe. And now it's time to apply the same recipe on the remaining parts of the world. As brave women have done in generation before us, we must act and we will succeed. Because this time, the alternative is simply not an option. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I apologize for that.
I'm sorry, I really do not mean to be rude, but I'm being coached down there. You need to stick to time. Thank you very much, Gunhild. Now just keep that number in mind. She said that 1/3 of the food produced in the world does not get eaten. That is something worth of a whole new discussion, which we will try and throw in the panel discussion later. Now, next one up is Josefina Skerk. She is an indigenous environmental activist and a Sami parliament member, and is going to talk about the experiences from indigenous women's advocacy. Welcome, Josefina.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Firstly, I want to start by noting the background, recognizing the background of indigenous women. For me, I often think about a woman, a role model and a hero from my childhood stories that my mother used to tell me. She was courageous, strong, independent and smart. But a couple of years ago, I found her name in some papers a friend handed around. Her name stood there and her measurements. And not only hers. Imagine being a 40-year-old woman, having a decent life in a place and under circumstances where most of us today would not survive. But when the Swedish scientists come, you don't only let them in. You let them measure your body and your head. They are only there to prove that you are a race, a lower standing race than the others, the majority society, that the Samis are genetically prone to be stupid and lazy, some kind of subhuman species. You let them in. And in a culture where nudity is not something you take easily upon, you undress and you let them take your photo. And you let them do this very same thing to your mother and to your 8-year-old daughter. It happened in my family when my grandmother was a child. And I share this background with many other indigenous women. We come from a place where from generations we've been told that what we are is not good, it's shameful. That the government has tried to take our lands, our lives, our languages, our traditional knowledge, our dignity and self-respect. So this has taken many generations for some, and less for others, to reach that point where you can start demanding your rights. But we're standing here today, I'm standing here. Imagine from that point to here. Imagine what she must have felt. Imagine what it would take for you to reach that point where you would let them in. And then you say, well, the Samis are too primitive, the Samis does not exist, the Samis do not have the right to equality. Well, we do. It's key. I'm a member of the Sami parliament, and you would imagine that the Sami parliament and the Swedish parliament would be equal, but we're not. We're oceans apart, you could in some way say, but it's not really appropriate. But you could say it's kind of like men and women back in 1905 when women did not have the right to vote or to their own economy. But anyhow. And because of that, we are pretty often compared to, well, let's say it like this. People say that the Sami culture, the Sami people need to be preserved. But as the wise woman Gun-Britt Retter often says, we are not strawberries. We do not want nor need to be preserved. We want to lead our own development. And this apparently does not happen through the Sami parliament currently. Not in every way, not in every needed way. So I, for once, stepped out of my role as a politician last spring and into a pair of skis And I skied to the North Pole together with Greenpeace in an expedition supported by 5 million people. It was pretty cool. And going from being a part of a small indigenous population and then moving into all of these millions of people who are saying that the Arctic matters to everyone, that indigenous people should have more of a voice in what happens, and that the Arctic also affects climate change in a crucial way, and we should not start drilling oil there, we should protect it instead. Yeah, it was kind of awesome. So we dropped a time capsule up there with millions of signatures inside to symbolize this, what I just stated. Others have taken other ways. My friend Andrea Landry, who's First Nation from Canada, joined up in the movement Idle No More, and she organized rallies and meetings and demonstrations with thousands of indigenous participants, some of whom had never moved up into something like that before. And they demanded indigenous rights. And they demanded a stop to the tar sands, which are destroying lands in Canada and also adding to climate change. And to find out what's happening to the indigenous women in Canada. And because of that demand, the police finally added the numbers. The last 30 years, over 1,200 women, indigenous women in Canada, have gone missing or been murdered in unsolved cases. There's much still to do. So, others of us organize in the UN. That's also a way forward. It's actually a great meeting place to meet people like Andrea and others, and to further build alliances and strengthen our leadership and build capacity from within. So I think I should not look down on international cooperation. It's actually, for us, been pretty key. The trouble is that Sweden is viewing the UN declarations that they have been a part of negotiating for 20 years as some kind of, well, this is the best case scenario. It's, well, we could aim for that. Well, we don't do it with other declarations, right? We try to live by them. So I think that is one of the demands that I would like to put forward, is that Sweden ensures indigenous human rights for the Samis. Thank you. Another way to move forward that's been great for us is through media. It's been needed because, as experiences from Andrea and others, sometimes local and national media does not have a big interest in portraying indigenous issues. Instead, when there was a conflict this last summer in Gallok, the first ever roadblock done by Samis in Sweden on Samiland. And the second one, or rather, if I put it like this, it was the second one ever and the first one in 30 years. So, pretty awesome. Media came from Taiwan. BBC came, several big newspapers from the US, Le Monde from France, Al Jazeera. I think it's one of the ways that we will move forward is by adding to the international pressure. And it is an important fact. Explaining why mining is a problem to the Samis is sometimes explaining sexism to a man who's never seen it, or understood it, or had any interest in it. When 90% of Europe's iron ore is taken from our lands without we having any saying in it, it's a problem. When over 500 new exploration permits are given on our lands without us as a people having anything to say about it, it's a problem. When we are losing the very last that we have because someone thinks that mining might be a good idea, it's a very big problem. We need to have a voice in that. And it's a huge problem also because the argument sometimes is, well, we need the mines because we all want phones and refrigerators and stuff, right? Well, the most of those mines are gold mines. And we have the industry's need for gold already taken up several hundred years on and on. It's already up. Why should we have more mines? It's not the future for us who want to live in the north of Sweden for many years, for many generations more. We need to take responsibility for the entire of Sweden for more than the four-year term that our leaders currently have in Parliament. So, I do not encourage violence, but I encourage action. What I've learned from this experience and from what I've been part of now and told you is that we do not get anything for free. Of course we don't. We have to cause trouble. We have to be trouble. That's the only way forward. And I think that we all can join up in that. We can support each other. We can connect as expected or unexpected allies. And I think that the struggle is the same, even if it's on a frozen ocean at the North Pole or a dirt road somewhere because of a mine or behind a desk. When we dropped the time capsule at the North Pole, was a text around it. It was a quote by Vandana Shiva. I read, "A new world is not only possible. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." Thank you.
Thank you, Josefina. You will get your flower after the panel discussion. That was beautiful, impressive. And great to have speakers from such different angles covering this important issue. Now, the last speaker is Annika Karlsson-Kaniyama. She is the Program Director for Climate Tools at the Swedish Defence Research Agency. And she is going to tell us if there is a difference between women's and men's consumption behavior and therefore their impact on climate. Annika,
Yes.
welcome.
Thank you. And the microphone is working? Great. So I will end up with something that some of you people may find a bit amusing. The differences in consumption patterns between men and women in the rich parts of the world. But they are really quite serious, given that we have to lower the emissions of greenhouse gases very drastically in a very short time in our part of the world. So let's start with asking ourselves, are there differences between how men and women consume in the rich parts of the world? And I'm going to say yes. Sometimes when you look at the consumption patterns of men and women and you look at the statistics, how women and men spend their money, for example, single men, single women, you get surprised that there is a consistent pattern that you thought were obsolete in a society like this. Like men spend their money more money on fuel and cars and machinery and hardware tools, and women spend their money on health care, clothes, they buy things to embellish their home. Men eat more outside, women less. Women smoke less and consume less alcohol than men do. So the consumption patterns are quite gendered, even in a society that is as equal as in Sweden. And we looked at consumption patterns in several other countries, and they are the same. So what in these consumption patterns are of importance when it comes to differences in emissions of greenhouse gases? I think you are all quite aware of that in order to lower the emissions of climate change, consumption patterns are questioned. We are required as citizens to think about our consumption, maybe to travel by car less, go less often with an airplane to Thailand, for example, or any other faraway place. And perhaps you already heard that it's very good to lower the consumption of especially red meat, because the production of red meat is very polluting in terms of greenhouse gas emission, especially methane. So let's go back to the consumption patterns of men and women. In the studies I looked at, which covers the Western world, I must say I haven't found studies about consumption patterns between men and women in the poorer parts of the world. But there are quite a few studies of how men and women eat in different countries, United States, European countries, and so on. And there is a consistent difference which appears in all these studies, and it is that men eat more meat than women do. And a very common argument when you sort of bring forward this knowledge is, but men are heavier, they have a bigger body, so they need to eat more meat. So researchers have tried to adjust for body weight to see if there is still a difference that cannot be explained by body weight in the amount of meat intake, and there is such an unexplainable meat intake by men that cannot be attributed to their body weight. So why is there a difference in meat consumption between men and women? Well, I'm a natural scientist, so it's not really my research area, but of the literature I've been able to read, meat has for very long been a symbol of power. Rich people eat meat, not poor people and so on. And as we don't live in a gender equal world, not even in our societies in the Western world, this may be a remnant from the past. Men do eat more meat than women do, and they do eat more red meat. And as another speaker told before, a very large part of the global greenhouse gas emissions, some have calculated almost 20%, are related to meat production. And at the same time, when we calculate the emissions for different foods over the life cycle, taking together production, transportation, packing, all the stages, we end up with very high emissions per kilo for red meat, for example, 30 kilos per kilo of food, while for vegetables, we end up with less than 1 kilo per kilo of food. And there has been numerous studies showing that by lowering our meat consumption, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions drastically, and we will also free a lot of agricultural land that is now used for producing fodder for cows, for example. So the difference in consumption between men and women, given different imprint when we calculate greenhouse gas emissions because of differences in meat consumption. Another area where we find consistent differences, and in this case we looked at single men and women in 4 European countries. It was Greece, Germany, Sweden and Norway. And we took statistics from single households and looked how men and women, single men and women, spend their money, even when they have about the same income. And there is a consistent difference in the transportation area, where men tend to like to use more of their money for buying cars and fuel than women do. So even if a man has a very small income, a single man has a small income, he can still spend more money on fuel and cars than a single woman with a higher income. And we can translate this knowledge about how much money is spent on fuel and cars versus going by train, going by boat, for example, bicycling and so on. We can translate these consumption patterns into emissions of greenhouse gases. And we find that the transportation emissions for men are consistently higher than for women in this study of European countries. And this is also relevant. It was relevant for all the countries, even gender equal countries like Sweden and Norway. So we end up with the knowledge, and this has been pointed out on numerous occasions, that it's not only that we are rich people who have high per capita emissions in countries like Sweden and other Nordic countries. There are also differences within our countries. And these differences are largely related to how much money we have. The more money we spend, the richer we are, the more emissions, because we buy a lot of stuff that were produced causing emissions during the production cycle. But there are also these differences between men and women which cannot be explained by income, by something else, which I think we should need to look further at, because we have the challenge ahead of us, lowering our meat consumption and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from our transportation patterns. So, in summary, what can we do with the knowledge that when men and women consume differently and cause different amounts in emissions of greenhouse gases? Well, I'm going to put forward some proposals. They haven't been accepted at the policy level yet, but it may be a point of discussion. First of all, we can think about whether or not we want separate statistics for energy use and greenhouse gases for men and women in a country, as a matter of perhaps thinking about how gender equal we are, how big is the gap between the average man and the average woman. It's quite possible to make these calculations, and they have been made, for example, by Statistics Sweden, so it's possible to do that and to follow up as an indicator of gender inequality. I'm also thinking about whether we could use the knowledge of gender-based differences in consumption patterns when we devise policy instruments for change. We are, for example, recommended to lower the intake of red meat, both for health and environmental reasons, and knowing that men eat more meat than women, could we target the campaigns to aim at men more than women, for example? Could we develop alternatives that are especially palatable to men rather than women, because women already eat not so much meat? And the same for transportation policy. When we want to devise, for example, information campaigns and eco-driving campaigns, should we target them at men rather than women, because women already travel much more by public transport? I think we could use this knowledge about that gender, when women consume differently, and that translates into differences in emissions. I think we can use it in the coming agenda for drastically lowering the greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annika. Please do not leave the stage. We're going to start the panel discussion. Josefina Stark and Caroline Hannem are coming up here on the stage. Now, it's been wonderful to listen to those four speakers. I have like 33 questions. I'm going to try and prioritize because we have about 20 minutes. First, just to pick on what you were talking about, Annika, about the consumption. Do you think, in relation to climate change and the prevention of it, we all know that we need to change our lifestyle.
Yeah.
Do you think women are more prepared to do that, given that they eat less meat, they use less gas, they do not own the old companies? It's less of a sacrifice for them maybe to change the lifestyle. Do you think so?
Well, surprisingly, there has been quite a lot of studies of asking people how worried are you about climate change and what are you willing to do. And usually women are more worried. Women are more worried about anything, basically, in any survey. They are always more worried, and there are some tentative explanations. But in these surveys, women are also much more positive to driving slower, and so they are more positive to adjusting their behavior. Already, they do not behave as badly as men already. But women are more positive for change, yeah. So I don't know if we should do that information. Should we sort of hope for the women to change, and leave the men aside, or should we try to engage the men in changing their more polluting behavior? I think that's
Or should we get more women to lead the change.
Yes,
maybe
to lead the change, yeah.
Turn over to you, Caroline, because what I found very interesting is the time factor. We know that we have little time. We're continuously being told by scientists that we have little time, we have to change our behavior. It's going really slow. And what is so interesting is that, I mean, in Norway and in Iceland, we had to put a law in place to increase gender equality within companies, the boards of companies, even though every research shows that the bottom line is better. It works better with both genders on the board, but it just didn't happen. It didn't all the same. So this kind of spurred, I connected those two things, that maybe can we make a law? Is it something that can we force this to go faster?
Well, one thing that strikes me when I listen to climate change debates is how much it's focused on technology and financing, and how little focused on the local level, on people. I mean, of course, you can see reference to consumption patterns and land use patterns. But I sometimes wonder if we shouldn't go back and look at Agenda 21. You remember after Rio what a mobilisation there was at local level, and how much focus there was on establishing things at community level and getting people engaged. And I think if we had more of that men would also become more engaged. I think that there's a capacity there that's not being developed. So that would be one suggestion, to try and get more emphasis on that. Talk more about what does it mean for people at different levels, men and women, and get it into schools as well. I think it's very important to start that way.
Needed to become more mainstream.
Yes.
But it's also maybe because it's still being discussed whether it's true or not.
Yes, but the evidence is increasing.
If we leave that aside, Josefine, I found this quote really, really interesting. We're not strawberries. We don't want to be preserved. We want to lead our own development. And because I think, you also mentioned the media. The media will go and cover stories on the indigenous people because they're cute and different, but they're not the big players. So, and the image is that it's a conservative society, but like the indigenous communities, they're conservative, they don't even know what women's rights are, etc. Is that something that you might have to focus on to kind of push up your women to show your force?
How do you mean focus on?
To get your women in forefront, to show your force.
Honestly, when I look at which people showed up at the protests this summer against mining, it was mostly women. When we look at who are the leaders in the Sami parliament, over Sápmi, the entire area, it's a lot of women. We have a lot of strong women already. And I can see from the Sami parliament's perspective, when we got funds to work with gender equality, we reached 50-50 in a couple of years.
In a couple of years?
In a couple of years. The Sami parliament for 2 periods have been 50-50.
Well done.
Thank you.
Yes. But then maybe I'm here a bit to play the devil's advocate. Is it maybe, okay, not only are there indigenous, but they're also women, so it even makes you less of a player? Do you feel that at any point?
Yeah, it is a point that we are in a majority society that is patriarchal, and that structure is even within the Sami community as well. So of course, it can be an issue if you, or as me, when I arrived at the Sami minister's place, and he's an older man, and I was a 22-year-old woman, and he started hitting on me. It wasn't the nicest situation, but we are facing realities, and we're working with it. And I can, well, of course, there are conservatives within the indigenous groups, but we are an entire people. There is all kinds of groups.
Exactly.
I think they should be recognized as well.
Like in any other nation?
Like in any other.
Just because, we're talking about environment and equality. One thing we also have to face, we've all heard these numbers. If every person on the earth would consume like we do in the Western world, we would need quite a few planets. The earth would never support it. how can we support women that live in poorer communities without necessarily, I mean, it's obvious that they would like to consume, they want nice clothes, they want the cosmetics, they want all the food that they don't have to worry about, they can buy it easily in the stores like we do, etc. How can it be done that you push up gender equality without increasing the burden on the planet?
Well, I think really people who have a very low consumption standard today, they cannot consume more without increasing the emissions, and that's why we have to lower ours. It's not possible. We have to lower ours, really.
What if it doesn't happen?
Well, we are now on the track for plus 6 degrees by the end of this century, and the consequences are totally unknown. The IPCC's latest reports on the impacts on adaptation say that there will be a major food crisis if we approach this kind of temperature. The effects are unknown. We don't even know what's going to happen. I mean, the Earth will survive, but what about civilization? That's how I see it.
Most of my experience has been in developing countries through my work in the UN. And I see there that women in risk areas, they're not looking to increase their consumption. They want help to be able to carry out their sustainable livelihoods. They need, more financing. They need more capacity building. But a lot of the interventions that are being put into climate change are too high tech and too high level. It has to come down to the level where women are working, where they're struggling to do the jobs that they have to do, and they're not getting the support they need. And I recently went back and looked through all the agreements that have been made, say, over the past 10 years in the climate change convention discussions. And women's groups and networks have been working so hard. They've invested so much time and effort and energy in getting a few words into a text. And I read out to you earlier the kind of words they're getting in. We must give attention to a gender perspective, to a gender-sensitive approach. What does it mean? What difference is it going to make in the interventions that we're making? This is, I think, the struggle to get some meaning into those words we get into a text. I'm not saying it's not important to do that. I think it's very important. We've got 1 year now until the next global climate change convention is going to be agreed. So we need to really work to get in the text. But we also need to look at how do you implement that? What does it mean on the ground in Sweden or in Tanzania, where I've worked, for example? How do you support women in that way? That's our big challenge as I see it.
Another big challenge is just, we might say, the schizophrenic way our societies are, because women are being pressured. I mean, women should definitely have a higher salary than men. When you look at the demands that are made of all the cosmetics, the makeup, the clothes, and all that, they are supposed to consume to, remain in. In the meantime, we're being told, we should reduce our consumption. There is something, the market is really pressuring from the other side. I mean, do you have any suggestions how to change that? Show up on TV without makeup? I mean, that doesn't work.
Well, yes, I think show up TV without makeup and with second-hand clothes and be proud of it. I think that's a good idea. I mean, why are women urged to consume a lot? Is because the companies want to profit from us.
But you know what happens then? Then, people stop listening to what you're saying and they say, oh my God, what's she got on? Why didn't she have, people stop listening to what you say?
I think
or maybe not.
But I think we have a good role model in Sweden. She's like 70-something, Marit Paulsen. She's a politician. She's a tant. And she's proud of it. I think we need more tanter and that are proud of it. I want to be a proud tant as well.
Right, exactly.
Don't you think that is also an aspect that someone needs to break to be the first one to do it? And then others will follow and you will build that kind of movement. It will always be tough for the one who walks first.
But we also know how it's been through. It's so easy to because the message, even to young girls, is that they should, wear short skirts. They should always have new clothes. They should wear a lot of makeup. They should.
Yeah.
But then, at the same time, you look like this. We can't. You can't talk seriously. We can't take you seriously looking like that. This mixed message they get.
I have some comforting message that the greenhouse gas emissions per crown for makeup and clothes is very low compared to red meat and petrol. So you can buy a lot of makeup if you don't eat red meat.
Right. Exactly. We still have time. Easy. Now, you have all talked about action, that the time of rhetoric is over, that we really need to create a new momentum, that we need to take women out of the victim role and just go beyond it. We need to implement. What are the key steps to do that? I mean, this is what this Nordic Forum is about. It's time for action. Where do we take it? In this, when I'm talking about this issue here that we're talking about. I mean, what's the first step from all the rhetoric to action? Josefina, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it's quoting Pippi Longstrump and saying, "I've never done this before, so I'm sure I could do it."
Yeah. I think it's time to really be realistic about if we have, for example, in Norway, you have the law saying that you have at least 40% women in the boards of companies, for example. I think we really have to try to imagine what would happen if women had actually more power. I mean, all the investigations show that women are more concerned about climate change, about environmental problems. As I said, they are more worried about everything. They want to do more and so on. I think we should take it seriously to try to imagine what would be the impact if we had more gender equality in decision making. I think it would be very important to try to really portray the differences that it would make, because probably it would make a difference. Every time I bring this up, people say, but maybe these women who come into power, they are so much like men that they would do the same thing. And I think we need some research, qualified guesses about what would happen with more gender equality when it comes to environmental concern and equity and so on, minority rights and...
They're also sometimes criticized for not having the stamina, that they will stay for 4 years, 8 years, and then they're out, that they don't have the stamina to follow through. Is there something to that in the political arena? Caroline?
Yeah, I think we have to stop accepting the rhetoric, because I get so tired when I hear people in very important positions saying wonderful things about women. I read one the other day where somebody very high up in the climate change world said, we need this change to renewable, affordable, sustainable energy, and women will lead that change. And it sounds wonderful at a conference or in some kind of a political context, but what does it actually mean? And what is that person prepared to do to make sure that that actually happens? Because I see all the women that I've met in villages in, for example, in Tanzania, they don't have access to decision making. They are leaders, they do know what they're doing and they are trying to bring about change, but they don't have the resources they need. So I want to know, when people say things like that, what do they mean and what are they prepared to invest? What are they prepared to do to make sure that women get that leadership capacity? And the other thing I think we have to be much, much better at is explaining why incorporating a gender perspective, taking away gender inequalities, reducing women's vulnerabilities, empowering them, giving them rights is actually going to help our fight against climate change. I think we're not good enough at actually showing in very practical ways what that means. I think we've had some really good examples from both of you and also from our earlier speaker, but in many areas we don't have enough of that. I think we have to get better at that. We've also been, I think, guilty of rhetoric. We need to be much, much more concrete.